The letter was sitting on my front porch when I got back from clearing the Hendersons' driveway, and I knew before I even opened it that it was going to ruin my morning. It was printed on that thick cream-colored HOA stationery with the little embossed logo in the corner, the kind that cost probably 3 times more than it needed to because someone on the board thought it made them look official. My fingers were still numb from the cold, my boots were caked with packed snow, and there were about 6 more inches of fresh powder expected before nightfall. The last thing I needed was to stand on my own porch in 15-degree weather reading a formal notice from the Maple Ridge HOA. But there I was. I tore it open anyway. "Dear Mr. Wallace," it started, because of course it used my last name, because formality is the language of people who want to seem more important than they actually are. "It has come to the attention of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association that you have been operating motorized equipment on a neighboring property without explicit written authorization from the board. This activity is in potential violation of Section 7, Subsection C of the Maple Ridge HOA Community Standards, which prohibits commercial or compensatory service activities within the community boundaries. You are hereby instructed to cease this activity immediately pending a formal review. Failure to comply may result in fines beginning at $250 per occurrence. Signed, Brenda Vandermeer, Vice President, Maple Ridge HOA." I read it twice. Then I looked down the street toward the Hendersons' house, where the driveway I had just spent 45 minutes clearing was now clean and passable for the first time since the storm had started 2 days ago. Harold Henderson was 78 years old with a bad hip, and his wife Dorothy was 74 and had just come out of knee surgery 6 weeks ago. They had no family nearby, no hired help, and their driveway was a long, sloping stretch that connected their garage to the street. When 14 inches of snow and ice had dropped on us in 2 days, they were effectively trapped. Harold had knocked on my door the morning after the storm and asked, real quietly, almost embarrassed about it, if I knew anyone with a snowblower he might be able to hire. I told him I had one, and that I didn't want his money. That was 3 days ago. I had cleared their driveway twice since then, and now apparently I was a threat to the community. I walked back inside, set the letter on my kitchen counter, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and sat down to think about exactly what I was going to do about Brenda Vandermeer. Let me back up a little so you understand the full picture here, because this story really starts about a year before that letter landed on my porch. I moved into Maple Ridge about 4 years ago when I transferred jobs. It's a nice neighborhood, genuinely nice, the kind of place where people put lights up at Christmas and kids actually play outside during the summer. The houses are well kept, the streets are clean, and for the most part the HOA is one of those background things you mostly just pay dues to and forget about. Or at least it was, until Brenda Vandermeer got voted onto the board. Brenda had been living in Maple Ridge for about 8 years. She was in her late 40s, the kind of woman who wore coordinating winter scarves and gloves even when she was just checking her mailbox, and who had somehow decided that being vice president of a neighborhood HOA was essentially the same as being a mid-level municipal official. She drove a white SUV with a personalized plate that read MPLRDG1, and she had replaced her mailbox post with one that had the HOA logo carved into it, which felt like a lot of commitment to an organization that nobody else in the neighborhood was particularly passionate about. She ran her section of the street like a small fiefdom, kept detailed notes on her neighbors' lawn maintenance schedules, and had already issued more formal notices in her first year on the board than the previous 3 board members combined had issued in 4 years. She was, in short, exactly the kind of person who ruins a neighborhood. I had already had 2 minor run-ins with her before the snowblower situation. The first was over a basketball hoop in my driveway that she claimed was a permanent fixture requiring board approval because it had a weighted base. I pointed out that it had wheels and could be moved, She insisted that the filled base constituted a semi-permanent installation, and eventually I moved it 3 feet to the right to show her it wasn't cemented to anything, and she backed off. The second was when she sent me a warning about holiday lights still being up on February 3rd, which was technically 2 days after the deadline in the community standards. I took them down that same day because I genuinely had forgotten, but the fact that she had been watching closely enough to notice on the 3rd was not lost on me. So by the time the snowblower letter arrived, I already knew what I was dealing with. The winter this year had been particularly brutal. December had come in with a light dusting here and there, the usual stuff, manageable, and then January had basically declared war on the entire region. We got 3 major storms in 11 days. The roads in and out of the neighborhood were iced over twice. The local hardware stores ran out of ice melt before the second storm even finished, and 3 different people on my street had pipes freeze, including, as a small measure of cosmic justice, Brenda Vandermeer, who had apparently been too busy policing the neighborhood to properly insulate her garage utility line. I heard about the pipe situation from my neighbor across the street, Tom Rafferty, who was a plumber and had been called out to fix it. Tom was a good guy with a dry sense of humor who had already had his own skirmishes with Brenda over the color of his front door. My snowblower was a 2-stage machine I had bought 2 winters back when it became clear that the seasons around here were getting serious. It was a solid piece of equipment, nothing fancy, but it could chew through packed snow and throw it 20 feet without breaking a sweat. I kept it in my garage, maintained it properly, and used it on my own driveway before I used it on anyone else's. The morning after the big storm hit, my driveway took me maybe 25 minutes. Harold Henderson's took 45 because of the slope and the depth of the accumulation, but it was completely doable, and I was glad to help. What I didn't realize at the time was that Brenda had been watching from her window. See, Brenda lived 3 houses down on the same side of the street as the Hendersons. From her living room bay window, she had a clear sightline to Harold and Dorothy's driveway, and apparently she had been observing, making mental notes, and constructing a case before I had even gotten back to my own house. I would find this out later from Dorothy, who told me that Brenda had actually knocked on their door the day after I first helped them and asked Dorothy whether she was paying for services and whether she had gotten any kind of written agreement. Dorothy, who is one of the most genuinely sweet people I have ever met in my life, had been completely baffled by the question. She told me she had smiled at Brenda and said, "Eric is just being a good neighbor, dear," and that Brenda had given her this tight little smile and said, "I'm sure he is." I can picture exactly what that smile looked like. I read through the HOA community standards document that evening, because if Brenda was going to throw sections and subsections at me, I wanted to know exactly what those sections actually said. I had a copy in a folder in my home office, one of those documents that gets handed to you when you move in and immediately goes into a drawer for years. I found it, sat down at my desk with a highlighter and read the whole thing, not just the parts about motorized equipment, the whole thing, cover to cover. It took me about an hour and a half and it was genuinely illuminating. Section 7, subsection C, the one Brenda had cited, read as follows in its entirety. No homeowner shall operate a commercial business or provide compensatory services for hire from or within the community without prior written approval from the board. That was it. That was the whole subsection. The key words there, the ones I highlighted in bright yellow, were commercial business, compensatory, and for hire. Every single qualifier was about payment, about money changing hands, about this being a business transaction rather than a neighborly act. I had not charged Harold and Dorothy a single cent. I had not asked for anything. I had not advertised. I had not handed anyone a business card. I had simply cleared my elderly neighbor's driveway because there was 1.5 feet of snow and they couldn't do it themselves. I wrote all of this down on a legal pad in neat numbered points. the way I used to do when I was prepping for presentations at work, because I find that writing things out helps me organize my thinking, and also because there is something satisfying about having a physical document you can refer to later. Then I did something that Brenda probably did not anticipate. I called my friend Marcus Chen, who was a property law attorney I had met through a mutual friend at a backyard cookout 3 years ago, and who I had helped move some furniture for once. Marcus owed me one, and more importantly, Marcus loved this kind of stuff. I described the situation to him on the phone, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, not unkindly, just that specific laugh of someone who has seen this exact scenario play out before in exactly this way. Brenda read commercial services and decided neighborly help counted, he said. Apparently. That's not how that works, Marcus said. That clause is specifically designed to prevent people from running like a landscaping business out of their house or setting up a hair salon in their garage. It has nothing to do with one neighbor helping another for free. If they tried to fine you for that, they would lose in court so fast it would make their heads spin. HOA boards cannot restrict community interaction that doesn't involve compensation. That's what I figured, I said. But I want to make sure I have my ducks in a row before I respond to the letter. You're responding to the letter. Marcus sounded amused. Oh, absolutely. Want me to draft something? No, I said. I want to write it myself. But can I run it by you before I send it? He said yes, and we hung up, and I sat back down at my desk and started writing. The response letter took me 2 drafts. The first was a little too aggressive, more of a vent than a response, and I set it aside after reading it back to myself. The second was better. It was calm, measured, and meticulously specific. I acknowledged receipt of the notice. I quoted Section 7, subsection C in full. I then laid out, point by point, why the activity in question did not meet the criteria outlined in the clause, specifically noting the absence of any compensation, advertisement, or commercial intent. I referenced 2 state consumer protection rulings about HOA authority limitations that Marcus had texted me, which I wove in carefully so they didn't sound like I was just name-dropping case law, but actually supported the argument. I concluded by noting that I intended to continue assisting my elderly neighbors with snow removal on a voluntary, non-compensatory basis as a matter of basic community decency, and that I welcomed a formal board meeting to discuss the matter if the HOA wished to pursue it further. I sent a copy to Marcus, who called me back 20 minutes later and said, I might borrow this format. I printed 2 copies, put one in an envelope addressed to the HOA's P.O. box and kept one for my own records. I also sent a digital version by email to the general HOA contact address so there would be a timestamp on record. Then I went outside and cleared the Hendersons' driveway again because it had snowed 3 more inches overnight and it needed doing. I want to tell you that the letter settled the whole thing, but of course it didn't because Brenda Vandermeer was not the kind of person who read a rebuttal and thought, oh, I see the issue here, let me reconsider. She was the kind of person who read a rebuttal and thought, this person is challenging my authority and I need to escalate. She escalated. 4 days after I sent my response, I got another letter. This one was longer and had CC'd 2 other board members, a guy named Frank Holloway and a woman named Patricia Lynn. I knew Frank a little. He was quiet and mostly reasonable, and I didn't know Patricia well, but she had always seemed perfectly normal. The new letter doubled down on the original position but added a new angle. Now, in addition to the commercial services claim, Brenda was arguing that using a motorized snowblower on a neighboring property created a noise and nuisance concern under Section 12 of the Community Standards, and also a potential liability issue for the HOA if I were to damage the Hendersons' property or injure myself while on their premises. The noise and nuisance angle was laughable on its face. My snowblower ran during daytime hours, well within the noise ordinance time specified in the community standards, And it was a snowblower, not a concert. Every single person in the neighborhood had been running some form of snow-clearing equipment during this winter. The liability angle was slightly more creative but equally nonsensical, because the HOA was not a party to any private agreement between me and my neighbors, and had no liability exposure from voluntary actions I took on someone else's property. That wasn't how liability worked. That wasn't how any of this worked. But here's the thing about a second letter. A second letter means Brenda was committed to this. She wasn't testing the waters or sending a routine notice she expected to disappear. She was building a case, or at least she thought she was, and she was planning to take this somewhere. I started keeping a log. Date, time, what happened, who was present. I also checked my home security camera setup, which I had upgraded the previous spring after some packages went missing from porches on my street. I had 2 cameras on the exterior of my house, one covering the front driveway and door, and one covering the side yard. The front camera happened to have an angle that captured not just my driveway, but a portion of the street and the front section of the Hendersons' driveway, which was directly across and down slightly from my house. I went back through the footage from the days I had cleared Harold and Dorothy's driveway and confirmed that the footage was clear, and showed exactly what happened, me pulling my snowblower out, clearing their driveway and going back home. No money changed hands, no discussion of payment, just 2 old people standing inside a storm door waving thank you while I worked. I backed up all of that footage to 2 separate external drives and also uploaded it to a cloud account. Dorothy called me around this time, her voice a little worried, and told me that Brenda had knocked on their door again, and this time had been more pointed. She had told Dorothy that if they were receiving contracted services without board approval, the HOA could potentially assess a fee to the Henderson property for community standards violations. Dorothy was upset. Not for herself, she told me, but she didn't want me getting in trouble. I told her not to worry for a second and that this was being handled. Harold got on the phone after Dorothy, and his voice had that particular flat quality of an older man who has been pushed past politeness and is now just very, very done. He said, "Eric, I was an electrician for 37 years and I sat on 2 union negotiating committees. I know a shakedown when I see one." I told him I agreed and that I was documenting everything and that he and Dorothy should do the same, specifically write down the dates and content of any conversations Brenda initiated with them. Harold said he would. In the meantime, the neighborhood had been watching. In a close community like Maple Ridge, when drama happens on one end of the street, it tends to travel pretty quickly. Tom Rafferty, my neighbor across the street, had already heard about the letters because his wife Carla knew Dorothy from their book club. Tom told me that his next-door neighbor, a guy named Kevin Marsh who had 2 little kids and worked from home, had also gotten a warning letter from Brenda recently. This one about a temporary ice rink Kevin had built in his backyard for his kids, which Brenda claimed was an unauthorized, recreational structure. Kevin was furious about it and had been quietly fuming for a week. Tom's other neighbor, an older couple named the Garcias, had gotten a warning about a propane heater they were using on their covered porch, which Brenda claimed was a fire hazard under the community standards, even though the heater was a standard commercially available product rated for outdoor use. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't just about me and my snowblower. Brenda was on a campaign. The snowblower situation was just the one that had come to a head first, maybe because I had responded to her letter instead of ignoring it, and now she was invested. I knocked on Kevin's door one evening to introduce myself properly, because we had only really waved at each other before. Kevin was a tall, quietly intense guy in his early 30s who did something with software development. When I explained why I was there, he invited me in immediately, went to a desk drawer, and produced his own Brenda letter, which he had already annotated in red ink with point-by-point rebuttals. I liked him immediately. We sat at his kitchen table for about an hour comparing notes, and by the end we had identified 6 households on our street who had received formal notices from Brenda in the past 4 months, all of them for things that were either clearly outside the HOA's actual authority or were so minor they bordered on ridiculous. Kevin had been doing some research of his own. He had pulled the HOA's bylaws, the actual founding document rather than just the community standards pamphlet, and had found something interesting. The bylaws specified that formal notices could only be issued after a majority board vote, except in cases of immediate safety concern, which required a specific written justification. The community standards enforcement process was not supposed to be a single board member sending letters on HOA stationery. It was supposed to go through a vote. Brenda had been issuing notices on her own authority as vice president without bringing them to the full board, which meant most, if not all, of the letters she had sent out in the past few months were procedurally invalid. Did Frank Holloway or Patricia Lynn know she was doing this? I asked. Kevin shrugged. I don't know. Maybe she CC'd them after the fact on some of them, like she did with your second letter, but I'm not sure they understood they were being listed as endorsing decisions they hadn't actually voted on. That was a significant piece of information. The HOA had a general annual meeting coming up in 6 weeks, but any homeowner could request a special meeting with enough signatures, specifically 10% of the homeowners in the community. Maple Ridge had about 90 households. That meant 9 signatures. Between Kevin and me, we already knew of at least 6 households with grievances. We needed 3 more, which, given what I was learning about Brenda's activities over the past few months, seemed entirely achievable. Kevin and I drafted a request for a special meeting. We framed it neutrally, not as an attack on any individual, but as a request to review HOA enforcement procedures and confirm that they were being followed in accordance with the bylaws. We walked the petition around over the next 3 days, starting with the households we already knew about. Every single one of them signed without hesitation. We got our 9 signatures in 2 days and had 12 by the end of the 3rd day, because once people started talking to their neighbors, it turned out that Brenda's reach had been wider than even Kevin and I had initially understood. We submitted the petition to the HOA's official address, which was technically a P.O. box managed by Frank Holloway as board secretary. Frank called me the next day. He was quiet on the phone for a moment at the start of the call, the way someone is when they're choosing their words carefully. Then he said, "Eric, I want you to know that I was not aware of most of those letters until they were already sent. Brenda presented them to me and Patricia as notifications, not as things we had voted on." He paused. "I think we need to have a serious conversation at this meeting." "I think so too," I said. Frank sounded tired. He said he had been on the board for 2 years and that his primary interest was keeping the neighborhood functioning well, not policing residents for things that weren't genuinely problematic. He hadn't fully understood until he started reviewing the correspondence file that Kevin and I had compiled as part of the meeting request, how many notices Brenda had sent unilaterally. He said he was going to reach out to Patricia Lynn as well. Patricia Lynn, as it turned out, was even more surprised than Frank. Kevin had spoken to her before I did, and apparently her reaction when she saw the scope of Brenda's activities had been something along the lines of genuine, visible dismay. She had CC'd Patricia on a couple of the letters, Patricia told Kevin, but had described them as routine reminders rather than formal enforcement actions. Patricia had assumed they were friendly notes, not letters threatening fines. The difference mattered enormously, both legally and in terms of community relations. The special meeting was set for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the snow kept coming. January was not letting up, and the commute in and out of the neighborhood was genuinely terrible for several days when the main access road iced over badly enough that even cars with all-wheel drive were struggling. Harold and Dorothy's driveway needed clearing 4 more times over those 2 weeks, and I cleared it every single time. I kept my log updated with dates and times. I kept backing up my camera footage. I was not going to stop helping my neighbors, because a woman down the street had appointed herself arbiter of what qualified as acceptable human decency. About a week before the special meeting, something happened that shifted the whole situation into a different gear. I was outside one morning doing a quick pass on my driveway after a light overnight snowfall, maybe 2 inches. Nothing major, just enough to need clearing before work. It was early, maybe 7:15, still mostly dark, with that particular cold blue light you get in January when the sun isn't quite up yet, but the snow makes everything glow a little. I had finished my own driveway and had started walking my snowblower over to the Hendersons, because the light snowfall plus overnight temperature drop had put a hard crust on their previous cleared surface, and I wanted to get it before Harold came out and tried to chip at it with a shovel. Brenda appeared. She was in a heavy coat, scarf, gloves, the full setup, and she walked up my side of the street toward me with a deliberately measured pace, the way someone walks when they want to appear calm but are actually very wound up. She had a phone in her hand and the screen was facing outward, and it took me a second to realize she was video recording. "Mr. Wallace," she said, loud and clear, in the tone of someone performing for an audience that didn't exist yet. "Are you about to perform services on the Henderson property again?" I looked at her. I looked at the phone. I looked back at her. "Good morning, Brenda. Please answer the question. Are you performing services on the Henderson property? I'm going to clear a little snow from my neighbor's driveway," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "Same as I've been doing. You've received 2 formal notices instructing you to cease this activity. I've received 2 letters that I've responded to in writing," I said, "both of which are on record. Would you like to discuss the content of my responses?" She wasn't expecting that. The phone wavered slightly. "The HOA has determined that this activity is in violation of community standards." "The HOA," I said carefully, "is 3 board members. Frank Holloway told me he didn't vote on these notices. Patricia Lynn told Kevin Marsh she didn't either. So when you say the HOA has determined something, Brenda, what you actually mean is that you determined it, personally, without a board vote." I paused, "which isn't how it works according to the bylaws." The phone hand dropped about 3 inches. "I suggest you look at Article 4, Section 2 of the Maple Ridge HOA bylaws," I said. "Enforcement actions require a majority board vote except in cases of documented immediate safety concerns. Voluntary, uncompensated neighborly snow clearing does not constitute an immediate safety concern. I'll be at the special meeting in 6 days to discuss all of this further. You should bring the full board." I pushed my snowblower past her and went to work on Harold and Dorothy's driveway. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back to her house. My security camera caught all of it. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse, which was a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood with a meeting room that sat maybe 60 people. Kevin and I had not done any particular outreach beyond the petition, but word had spread. When Frank opened the meeting, there were 43 residents in attendance, which Kevin told me quietly was more than he had ever seen at any HOA meeting in the time he'd lived there. Brenda was seated at the board table with Frank and Patricia. She was in a blazer, which seemed like a choice for a neighborhood HOA meeting, and she had a folder in front of her. Frank had a folder too, but his looked thicker. Patricia had a notepad. Frank opened by explaining the purpose of the meeting, and then immediately, before Brenda could steer the agenda, announced that the board had conducted an internal review of enforcement notices issued in the past 6 months and had found procedural concerns that the board needed to address. He stated this plainly, without drama, but the room understood the implication immediately. Several people shifted in their seats. A couple of them exchanged glances. Brenda interjected, starting to explain that as vice president she had authority to issue preliminary notices pending full board review, which was a creative interpretation of the bylaws that Frank gently but firmly corrected on the spot by reading the actual bylaw text aloud. Patricia added that she had not understood the notices she was CC'd on to be formal enforcement actions, and that she did not consider herself to have approved them retroactively. That was essentially Brenda losing her majority at the board table in real time, in front of 43 neighbors. I was not the first resident to speak. Kevin went first and gave a clear, organized summary of the procedural concerns with reference to the relevant bylaw sections. He was calm and precise, and managed to make a pretty complex point completely accessible, which I suspected was related to his job. Then two other residents spoke, including the Garcias, who described the propane heater situation, and a woman named Linda Farris, who had gotten a notice about a wind chime that Brenda had decided violated the noise provisions of the community standards, which genuinely drew audible reactions from the room. Because if you are sending formal warnings about wind chimes in a neighborhood with winter storms, you have lost the plot entirely. When I spoke, I kept it simple. I described what had happened with the Hendersons. I described the letters. I read from my response letter. I noted that I had security camera footage of the incident that morning, including Brenda's attempt to document me cleaning my elderly neighbor's driveway as some kind of violation. I mentioned Marcus's legal opinion on the compensatory services clause without reading the whole thing, just the core conclusion, which was that non-compensatory voluntary assistance between neighbors is unambiguously not subject to commercial services restrictions. Dorothy Henderson spoke after me, which she had not planned. She just raised her hand at the right moment. She stood up slowly, with Harold's hand at her elbow, and in a very quiet, very clear voice she described what it had been like to have Brenda come to her door and suggest that her receiving help from a neighbor might cause them to incur HOA fees. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get theatrical. She just explained it, and the room was completely silent while she did. When she finished and sat back down, Harold looked at the board table with exactly the expression I had imagined when he called Brenda's letters a shakedown. Brenda attempted a rebuttal, referencing the liability concern and suggesting that the board had a duty to protect the community, but at this point she had so thoroughly lost the room that her words were landing in silence. Frank cut her off politely but decisively and moved to the vote. The motion was to formally invalidate all enforcement notices issued without a prior board vote during the preceding 12 months, to require a majority vote for all future enforcement actions, and to formally instruct that the vice president did not have unilateral authority to issue notices on behalf of the HOA. It passed 2-1. Brenda voted against it, which surprised nobody. A second motion, which Kevin had suggested and Frank had agreed to add to the agenda, required the HOA to issue written apologies to all residents who had received improperly issued notices. That one also passed 2-1. The meeting had run about 90 minutes. When it ended, people stood around in the parking lot even though it was January and probably 20 degrees, talking in small groups in the kind of animated, slightly relieved way that happens when something that has been wrong for a while gets corrected. Harold shook my hand. Kevin clapped me on the shoulder. Tom Rafferty said loudly to no one in particular that he had been waiting for this meeting for 8 months. Brenda drove home alone. Now, I had genuinely hoped that would be the end of it. The procedural issue was resolved. The notices were voided. A clear policy was in place going forward. I had been cleared. The Hendersons had been cleared. Normal HOA functioning could resume, and we could all get back to the business of surviving what was turning out to be a genuinely brutal January. I wanted nothing more than to put the whole thing behind me and focus on keeping my pipes from freezing and helping Harold and Dorothy whenever the snow came down. But a week after the meeting, Kevin called me with something new. He had been reviewing the HOA's financial records, which were technically public to any member of the community upon request. He had requested them about a month before the special meeting as part of his research, and had only just received the full documents. What he found in them was not what either of us had expected. The issue was not just procedural. There were line items in the HOA's expense records over the past year that didn't make sense. Vendor payments for landscaping services that exceeded what any of the actual landscaping work on community property would have cost. Equipment maintenance invoices for community equipment that, as far as Kevin could tell from talking to other board members and neighbors, either didn't exist or hadn't been serviced. A couple of payments to a company Kevin couldn't verify had any presence online or in any business registry. He laid it out for me on his laptop when I came over, and I looked at it carefully. I was not a forensic accountant, but I had spent enough years working in corporate budgeting to know what irregular disbursements looked like. Some of these were in the range of $200 to $400, small enough individually that they might go unnoticed, but across a year they added up to somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 that could not be cleanly explained by the services nominally attached to them. "Do you think this is deliberate?" I asked. Kevin was quiet for a moment. "I think it's worth asking someone who knows more about this than we do." I called Marcus again. Marcus listened carefully, asked me to email him the specific line items Kevin had identified, and got back to me the following morning. His tone was noticeably different from the first call, more measured, more precise. He said that what I had described sounded like it could constitute financial misappropriation, which in the context of an HOA was a serious matter. He said the right step was not to confront Brenda directly or even bring it back to the HOA board first, but to report it to the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, which had oversight of homeowners associations, and to consult with a CPA who could properly review the books. "You could also contact local law enforcement," Marcus said. "Depending on the amounts and the pattern, this could cross into wire fraud territory if any of the transactions involved false documentation." We were no longer talking about snowblowers. Kevin and I put together a formal complaint package. We included the relevant financial documents with the questionable line items highlighted, a summary written by Kevin that was clear and methodical, and a note from Marcus that outlined the relevant legal framework without making specific allegations, since he was being careful about what he attached his name to before a proper investigation. We submitted it to the Department of Consumer Affairs, and after talking it over carefully, also filed a report with the local police department's financial crimes unit, which was mostly just a detective who handled things like small-scale fraud and embezzlement. The detective, whose name was Corrigan, called me back 2 days later. He was businesslike and gave nothing away about what he thought of the situation, which I understood, but he asked detailed follow-up questions and asked Kevin to come in for an interview. Kevin did, bringing his annotated copies of everything. I want to be clear that this part of the story took time. It didn't resolve in a week. The weather kept coming, the road stayed bad, and life continued on in the way it does while official processes grind forward. I cleared the Hendersons' driveway 7 more times over the rest of January and into February. Dorothy started leaving a thermos of hot coffee on their porch railing when she heard my snowblower starting up, tucked inside a little insulated carrier with my name written on a piece of masking tape, which I thought was one of the nicest things anyone had ever done for me without making a big deal of it. Harold and I developed a routine where after I finished he would come out and we'd stand on their porch for 10 minutes, just 2 guys talking, and those conversations were genuinely some of the best 10-minute conversations I had in that entire winter. Brenda, for her part, had gone quiet. She was still vice president nominally, but her practical authority was now limited by the new board policies, and she had apparently figured out that the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted in a way that was not going to reverse. People who had previously tolerated her or given her the benefit of the doubt now knew too much of the full picture. At the February board meeting, which Frank ran very differently than previous meetings, Brenda tried to table a motion about exterior paint color approvals, and Frank gently pointed out that the motion was outside the scope of what the board had discretionary authority over, and moved on to the actual agenda. It was not dramatic. It was just very, very clear. The HOA also sent out the formal apology letters that the board had voted to issue, one to each household that had received an improperly filed notice. Mine was signed by Frank and Patricia. It was brief and professional, and it cited the specific procedural violation. I kept mine in the folder with all the other documents. In early March, Detective Corrigan called me again. He was more forthcoming this time, which I took as a sign that something was developing. He said the investigation had identified a pattern consistent with financial misappropriation, and that the case was moving forward. He asked if I would be willing to provide a formal statement about the chain of events leading to the discovery of the financial irregularities. I said yes without hesitation. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, there were 2 police vehicles parked in front of Brenda Vandermeer's house for about 2 hours. I did not go outside and stare. I watched from my window once briefly, and then deliberately went to another room and stayed there because it was not a moment I wanted to gawk at. But I knew what it meant. Brenda was charged with misappropriation of funds, and 1 count of filing false business records, the latter being related to one of the vendor invoices that turned out to be connected to a shell company she had set up under a name that was just different enough from her own that it required some digging to trace. The amounts involved were not enormous in the grand scheme of things, a little under $4,000 over about 14 months, but the deliberateness of it and the false documentation made it a prosecutable offense rather than just a civil matter. She was released pending arraignment, and she did not come back to the neighborhood for most of the rest of the winter. She resigned from the HOA board by email a week after the charges. The email was short and said nothing about why. Frank called me when he received it and told me, and his tone was the kind of tired relief of someone who had been carrying a weight they didn't ask for and had finally been able to put it down. He said the board was going to hold elections to fill the vice president position properly, and that he hoped people would be willing to run. I suggested Kevin Marsh, who had the organizational mind and the genuine commitment to actual community welfare. Kevin ran. He won uncontested. The spring thaw came, as it always does eventually, and with it came the particular relief of a difficult winter giving way to the first warm days, when you wake up and the world doesn't have that cold blue silence, but instead has birds and the sound of melt water running in the gutters and the smell of wet earth. The snow that had been piled on either side of everyone's driveways for 3 months slowly shrank and revealed the dormant grass underneath. On one of the first really mild days of March, Dorothy Henderson left a note in my mailbox. It was a handwritten card, the old-fashioned kind, with a little winter scene on the front that was probably a leftover from Christmas. Inside she had written in her careful looping handwriting, "Eric, Harold, and I want you to know that we will never forget what you did for us this winter. Not because of the snow, but because of what it showed about who you are. The neighborhood is lucky to have you. We are lucky to have you. Come for dinner sometime soon. Dorothy and Harold." I put the card on my refrigerator with a magnet. It's still there. The legal case against Brenda worked through the system over the following months the way legal things do, slowly and without drama. She eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misapplication of fiduciary property, paid back the full misappropriated amount plus a civil penalty, and received a suspended sentence with community service. The community service, which Kevin pointed out to me with obvious satisfaction, required her to perform volunteer work with a registered nonprofit, which was a reasonable sentence but also a particular irony given the whole situation. She also paid fines to the state HOA oversight body as part of the civil resolution. The homeowners association itself, under Frank and Kevin's stewardship, went through something of a reinvention that spring and summer. They rewrote the enforcement procedures in plain language, posted the complete bylaws on a community website that Kevin set up, and established a clear appeals process for any resident who received a notice. The HOA dues were also reviewed, and as part of that review it came out that the dues had been quietly increased twice in the previous 2 years, increases that were technically within the board's authority but that had not been adequately communicated to residents, and that had padded the operating budget in a way that made the small-scale financial irregularities easier to hide. That increase was rolled back. People in the neighborhood still talk about the winter of the snowblower letters. Not constantly, not dramatically, just the way you reference something that was genuinely strange and is now genuinely over. It comes up when someone new moves into the neighborhood and asks about the HOA, because the story of how the current enforcement policies came to be is really the story of what happened that winter. Kevin tells it pretty well. Harold tells it better, because Harold has the benefit of lived experience and a dry union negotiating committee sense of humor, and also because the part where Dorothy describes Brenda asking whether they were receiving contracted services without board approval and Dorothy responding, "Eric is just being a good neighbor, dear," is genuinely one of the funniest moments in a story that also had some genuinely not funny moments. What I think about now when I think about that whole stretch is not actually Brenda. I don't spend much time thinking about Brenda. What I think about is that Tuesday morning in mid-January with the blue pre-dawn light and the fresh overnight snow and my snowblower running, pushing through that light crust on Harold and Dorothy's driveway while the rest of the street was still quiet, and the way Dorothy appeared in the storm door in her bathrobe with a coffee mug in her hands and waved at me from behind the glass because she didn't want to come out in the cold and I didn't want her to either. That's the part that sticks with me. That's the actual story, the real one, underneath all the procedural nonsense and the letters and the financial investigation. Just a person helping two people who needed help because it was cold and they were old and the snow was deep, and that's what neighbors do. The HOA tried to make that into something it wasn't. They dressed it up in subsections and liability concerns and compensation clauses and sent certified-looking letters on thick cream stationery to make it seem official and weighty. But underneath all of that it was just one person, Brenda Vandermeer, deciding that a simple human act of community was something she had jurisdiction over. And the answer to that, it turned out, was simply to know the rules better than the person who thought they owned them, to document everything, to find the people around you who were dealing with the same thing, and to show up at a community meeting on a cold January night with 43 neighbors and the truth written on a legal pad. I still clear Harold and Dorothy's driveway. I still have the snowblower. Nobody has sent me a letter about it since, and nobody is going to, because the current HOA community standards now include a specific clarification, proposed by Kevin and passed unanimously by the full board, that explicitly states voluntary, non-compensatory assistance between community members is not subject to commercial services restrictions, and is, in fact, encouraged. It's 2 sentences in a document that most people will never read. But I know they're there, and Harold knows they're there, and Kevin knows they're there, and on some level that matters. Last February, after the first real snowstorm of that season, I was outside with the snowblower doing Harold and Dorothy's driveway when I heard another snowblower start up from across the street. Tom Rafferty, who had watched the whole previous winter's drama unfold, had apparently bought his own snowblower over the summer. He was clearing the Garcia's driveway because Mr. Garcia had hurt his back in November. We looked across at each other over the noise of the machines, and Tom gave me a nod, one of those simple nods that means something without needing any words attached to it. That felt like the end of the story. That felt like what winning actually looks like. Not the meeting, not the vote, Not the charges filed or the guilty plea or the rewritten bylaws. Just two guys in January with snowblowers clearing their elderly neighbors' driveways, in a neighborhood where nobody was going to send them a letter about it. Harold came out eventually, hobbling a little on the bad hip, and stood on the porch steps and called out that the coffee was ready. Dorothy was already at the window in the kitchen, visible behind the frosted glass, and the light inside was warm and yellow against the white cold of everything outside, and it was about as close to a perfect moment as a January morning in a snowy neighborhood can get. I cut the snowblower engine, leaned it against the porch railing, went up the steps. Harold opened the door and let me in out of the cold.